Good morning to the DME for Peace community. Welcome to this week's edition of the M&E Thursday Talks on DME for Peace. These Thursday Talk webinars are made possible with the support of the Carnegie Corporation of New York through the Peacebuilding Evaluation Consortium. Just in case you've forgotten, my name is Jack Farrell and I am the DME for Peace project manager at Search for Common Ground based in a wonderfully humid Washington, DC. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Aprille Knox of Abdul, Latif, Jameel Poverty Action Lab's Crime, Violence and Conflict team to host the M&E Thursday Talks to really lead a discussion on randomized evaluations in peace building and conflict violence reduction beyond what works. Just a note, you can ask questions throughout the webinar by either writing a question in the question function on your GoToWebinar dashboard, and we'll move on to that once Aprille has finished her presentation. I'm now going to hand over to today's host. Aprille, you are very welcome, and the floor is all yours.
Great, thanks, Jack, and good morning, everyone. As Jack mentioned, my name is Aprille Knox, and I am a Senior Policy Associate at the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, or JPAL, where I work on our crime, violence, and conflict sector. And I should note that I am joined today by my colleague, Killian Nolan, who's joining remotely, and will be helping to field some of your questions at the end. And so he's also on the line. For those of you who may not be familiar with JPAL, we are a global research center working to reduce poverty by ensuring that policy is informed by rigorous scientific evidence. We're based at the economics department at MIT, where we're anchored by a network of roughly 170 affiliated professors from around the world who are united in their use of randomized evaluations as a tool for answering critical questions in the fight against poverty. So today we're excited to talk to you about how randomized evaluations can be used by implementers and policymakers to better understand what kinds of interventions contribute and how they contribute to sustainable peace. So we'll start by providing an introduction to randomized evaluations as an impact evaluation methodology. Then we'll go through a case study of how this methodology has been used to assess the effectiveness of reconciliation processes in Sierra Leone. And finally, we'll close with a quick overview of some ongoing and innovative research, as well as open questions that we think that randomized evaluations may be able to help answer in this space, before opening it up to you all for any questions that you might have for us. So to start off, why randomize? By your participation in today's webinar, we assume that you have some general interest in how evidence can be used to inform and improve peace building. And this is an incredibly important question because we see that globally, most of the world's poor live in fragile states. Yet we lack much rigorous evidence on what types of programs and interventions work to build peace and stability in conflict and crisis-effective contexts, and how. So to determine what works, we need to understand the impact of a given intervention. But trying to capture impact of an intervention can be quite challenging. So for instance, we might want to understand whether delivering conditional or unconditional cash transfers in the wake of violence or potentially implementing alternative dispute resolution processes are effective in reducing violence and promoting social cohesion. But by simply measuring violence levels or levels of social capital before and after the program is implemented, we may be led to incorrect conclusions about the efficacy of these interventions. So for instance, if we see that violence levels are reducing, it's possible that there are also some other factors at play beyond the intervention that may have contributed to these outcomes. For instance, something as seemingly innocuous as changes in seasonal temperature may actually lead community tensions to dissipate for very different reasons. So instead, we need to sort out the causal linkages between a program and the desired outcome. And impact evaluations offer an avenue for deciphering these causal linkages. So the purpose of today's webinar is to explain how impact evaluations, and specifically randomized evaluations or randomized control trials or RCTs, which is what we specialize in here at JPAL, can be used as a tool to not only unpack what works in peace building and violence reduction, but also to help develop, illustrate, and test fundamental theories of peace, violence, and recovery. So recognizing that you as participants are probably coming from a lot of different backgrounds and may have different levels of understanding of impact evaluation, I thought it'd be useful to start off by just summarizing what at JPAL we define as impact and what we see to be as impact evaluations. So at JPAL, we define impact as a comparison between the outcome sometime after the program has been introduced and the outcome at that same point in time had the program not been introduced, which we refer to as the counterfactual. And the critical objective of an impact evaluation is to establish a credible comparison group. So this is a group of individuals that, in absence of the program, would have had outcomes similar to those who were exposed to the program. However, the problem is that the counterfactual cannot actually be observed. And so instead, we need to mimic or construct the counterfactual. But in reality, it's generally the case that individuals who participate in a program and those who did not are different in some way. For instance, it's possible that a program was implemented in a specific geographic area, for instance, in a poorer or a richer neighborhood, or that individuals were screened for participation into the program, for example, on the basis of poverty or on the basis of their motivation to participate. And in addition, the decision to participate is often voluntary. So for these reasons, those who are not exposed to a program often are not a great comparison group for those who actually were exposed to the program. And any differences that may arise between these groups can be attributed to multiple factors. It could be these pre-existing differences that I've described, which we refer to as selection bias, or it could be that we're actually seeing the true impact of the program. But there are a number of assumptions that underlie that. So by randomly assigning participants to treatment, we can mitigate some of these challenges of selection bias, and I'll go into that a little bit more in the next couple of slides. To help illustrate the importance of establishing the counterfactual, let's pretend that we're a small NGO implementing a community-driven reconstruction program following a protracted conflict, and we want to know whether it's effective in increasing social capital. So we're using social capital as a measure for the number of close relationships community members report as sort of a proxy for trust and social cohesion. So how can we tell if our program is achieving its desired impact? We introduce the intervention, and then we can see from this graph that following the intervention, measures of social capital increase. So this may lead us to automatically assume that the program is working. But without the counterfactual, we really can't know. The impact that we're seeing could be because of the program, but it also could be because of something else that's happened in the country, whether this is another peace-building intervention or a broader government policy. And with randomized evaluations, the idea behind constructing the counterfactual is to select a group that is exactly like the group of participants in all ways except for one, and that's their exposure to the program that's being evaluated. So let's imagine again that we are the NGO looking to measure the impact of our CDR program. Before the program starts, communities are randomly split into 2 or more groups so that at the beginning of the program, they are statistically identical at the outset. So one group then receives the treatment while the other acts as a comparison group. And at the end of the program, we measure outcomes for both groups. The 2 groups continue to be identical throughout the program except for the treatment. And because members of the treatment and control group do not differ systematically at the outset of the experiment, any differences that subsequently arise between them can be attributed to the program rather than to other factors. So this is a pretty quick, high-level introduction to randomized evaluations, but I hope that the intuition is clear. Before going into a specific example, it is important to acknowledge that randomized evaluations are not always appropriate or feasible. Particularly in fragile contexts, there's often concerns that are expressed that randomly assigning treatment to some segments of the population over others may be unethical, operationally difficult, or simply too costly. But these critiques are not unique to peace-building interventions, although the risks may be heightened in post-conflict settings. And it's certainly true that some interventions cannot and should not be randomized. There are some interventions that we simply should make available to everyone. For instance, we would never deny food aid to a population suffering from famine. But in peace building, as with many other sectors like education or health, we're often operating under a world of constrained resources. So when we have important questions to be answered and demand exceeds supply, randomly assigning groups to treatment may arguably be the fairest, most transparent, and often politically palatable solution, as all groups have equal probability of being assigned to treatment. And at a more fundamental level, it's important for us to examine the assumption that the interventions delivered in conflict or post-conflict settings are necessarily beneficial. Because most peacebuilding and conflict reduction interventions have not yet been rigorously evaluated, there are genuine questions that remain regarding their efficacy. So to help illustrate how randomized evaluations can be used to build our theoretical understanding of peace, violence, and recovery, I'll walk through a particularly interesting example from some researchers within our affiliate network that comes from Sierra Leone. And this example has led us to question some of our fundamental assumptions about when and how reconciliation interventions should be implemented. To set the stage, Sierra Leone experienced a devastating civil war from 1991 to 2002, during which time more than 50,000 people were killed and over half the population was displaced. And much of this violence took place within communities, with members of the same villages fighting each other. So theory tells us that following conflict, there's a common assumption that societies need to unify and rebuild social capital. So as we've seen in a number of different countries, truth and reconciliation processes have commonly been adopted as a method for addressing wartime grievances. We've seen this in South Africa, Peru, Rwanda, to name just a few places. Yet despite the proliferation of these types of interventions, we have little knowledge of whether and how reconciliation processes help communities heal from conflict. However, Sierra Leone decided to follow the same model, and the Sierra Leonean government and international community created a special court to try the most high-profile perpetrators, and they also set up a national Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But the commission only had the capacity to cover a small fraction of the atrocities that happened during the war. And as a result of this, very few rural Sierra Leoneans were able to participate, and large swaths of the population were left out of the reconciliation process. So to fill this gap, Fambul Talk, which is a local Sierra Leonean NGO, was established in 2007 to address wartime grievances and facilitate local level reconciliation in rural communities. And like other truth and reconciliation processes, Fambul Talk's program created forums for victims to describe the violence they experienced and for perpetrators to seek forgiveness for the crimes. They did this by first consulting all village chiefs to get their consent and support for the project, and then coordinated several months of community organization, training in trauma healing and mediation, and outreach to encourage victims and perpetrators to participate in truth-telling processes. And these activities culminated in a 2-day-long bonfire ceremony where victims shared their stories and perpetrators asked for forgiveness for their wartime crimes. To continue community healing after the ceremony, Fambul Talk set up symbolic peace tree in each village, and in some areas, communal and peace groups. And notably, this intervention was relatively low cost, costing between just $150 and $200 per ceremony. And after a few years of running this program, Fambul Talk decided that they wanted to understand if it was actually achieving its desired impacts of increasing forgiveness and social cohesion. And we're also curious about the psychological effects that the program may be having on community members. So in order to understand whether the reconciliation program was achieving its intended impacts, they partnered with researchers, Jacobus Cillier, Angela Dubé, and Bilal Siddiqui, to test the program's impact on forgiveness of war perpetrators, psychological well-being, and social capital. And to do so, they leveraged a planned expansion of the program to 5 new districts in 2011. The researchers rolled out the evaluation in 3 waves in order to take into account Fambul Talk's own capacity constraints. And then within each wave, the research team matched sections, which are a subunit of the district, into pairs using baseline data on exposure to violence, conflict incidents, economic activity, and psychological health. And then they randomly assigned sections in each pair to either participate in the program or to be part of the comparison group. I should note that in wave 3, the researchers were not actually able to follow up and collect data because of the Ebola epidemic that disrupted this wave of the research. But for the other 2 waves, researchers surveyed participants between 9 and 31 months after the ceremonies to gauge the program's impact on forgiveness, social networks, community participation, and psychological health. And they found that the program led to some notable positive impacts. For instance, it led to greater forgiveness of perpetrators and strengthened social capital. And the program also significantly increased trust of ex-combatants and of migrants who were commonly perceived by community members as being ex-combatants. Furthermore, individuals in program villages were more likely to participate in community groups, such as parent-teacher associations and women's groups, and they were more likely to contribute to public goods, like donating to public facilities, including health centers. However, the reconciliation program worsened measures of psychological well-being. It resulted in higher prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder and increased prevalence of depression and anxiety. And these effects for both social capital and psychological factors persisted 3 years after the program was implemented. So given the continued proliferation of reconciliation programs following conflict, how does this study help us understand the efficacy of these types of interventions? Firstly, the positive effects on forgiveness and social capital suggest the need for reconciliation persists long after violence ends. But the negative psychological impacts indicate truth-telling open up psychological wounds, which is a sign of the potency of war memories when suddenly evoked. So overall, these findings suggest that future reconciliation programs should be redesigned to maintain societal benefits without imposing psychological costs. And there are a number of potential avenues for additional exploration to improve these types of processes. This could include examining the timing of reconciliation processes. So for instance, implementing these programs immediately following conflict when people are still processing these events rather than reopening wounds later on, or pairing reconciliation processes with counseling or other forms of psychological support. And the Sierra Leone study is just one example of how randomized evaluations can be utilized to answer fundamental questions related to peace, violence, and conflict. We're increasingly seeing innovative studies emerging to tackle these topics. And some examples include a number of studies related to the effect of social contact. So whether or not bringing disparate groups together through dialogue and other activities can promote social trust and cohesion. There's two notable studies that are about to begin looking at social contact theory. One in Nigeria, where researchers will look at whether dialogue between farmers and herders who have historically been in conflict can promote social trust by examining how contact influences conflict. Similarly, a study in Iraq will examine whether or not bringing Iraqi Christians displaced by ISIS together with Sunni Arabs on mixed soccer teams will reduce prejudice and rebuild social trust. We're also seeing a number of interesting studies emerge related to preventing gender-based violence. So in collaboration with the government of Peru, researchers are piloting an intervention to reduce gender-based violence through a community-based approach in which local leaders will be trained to become community health volunteers and to work with their communities on gender-based violence prevention, monitoring, and reduction. And then finally, we're seeing a lot of new research related to crime and policing, and we think that this has interesting implications for the peace building sector as well. So in Papua New Guinea, researchers are studying how expanding the presence of community police into remote villages with little state presence affects crime and victimization rates, as well as its impact on other community level institutions for justice and order. So these are just a few examples, but show how randomized evaluations can be implemented in contexts that are traditionally seen as quite challenging to work in and can help to answer some of these fundamental questions that shape our understanding of peace building and violence reduction. That all being said, quantitative evidence is still quite modest, and there's much additional room for randomized evaluations on a number of different topics. So some additional topics that certainly warrant further exploration include participation in organization of violence, security provision and efficacy of the justice sector, refugees and internal displacement, building and maintaining stability after violence, and crisis prevention, response, and recovery. And so this is certainly not an exhaustive list, but these are a number of topics where we see randomized evaluations as potentially to actually help build the evidence base in these areas. So as a final note to end on, the goal of pursuing these types of research questions is to start to build a coherent evidence base around effective strategies for peace building and violence reduction. So moving away from just discrete program evaluation to actually developing more generalizable lessons that can begin to be applied and tested in new contexts. So with that, I will open it up to any questions that you may have for me and for my colleague Killian. My email is also here if you would like to take any questions offline, but looking forward to the continued discussion.
Thank you very much, Aprille. You've given us a lot to think about, and a very warm welcome to Killian, who is now able to join us for the Q&A. A couple of notes about our format. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Thursday Talks, you can submit a question or a comment in one of two ways. The first is through the question function on GoToWebinar, where you can type your question. The second is to click on the hand button, the little hand icon on your GoToWebinar dashboard, which will raise your hand and allow us to unmute your microphone so you can ask your question live. When you do submit your question, we ask that you submit your name and affiliation. Just a note, these talks are recorded and posted on DME for Peace's media gallery, so that those who are not able to join us at this time can go back and listen to the presentation and the discussion and learn from our wider engagement. Now, to get us underway, guys, the questions have been already flowing through. The first comment comes from our recent Thursday Talk host, Tillman Bruck of the ISDC in Germany. And Tillman says, congratulations, that must be the first time anybody has ever been able to reference Calvin and Hobbes in an impact evaluation talk. Yeah, I think that's the first time I've heard it on the Thursday Talks as well. But our first question comes from Milt Lauenstein, and Milt writes, the purpose of measuring effectiveness is to help guide asset allocation in the future. The best way to allocate resources depends not only on effectiveness, but on cost. Has JPAL done, or does it plan to investigate cost effectiveness of various approaches to peace building on reducing armed conflict?
Yeah, this is a great question. So within JPAL, we have something called the Crime and Violence Initiative, which is our funding arm for new research related to these topics. And within part of the requirement of getting funding through that research initiative is to actually to collect cost data. So the idea is that by collecting that cost data, it will allow us to eventually do cost effectiveness analysis. Unfortunately, at this point, we just don't have enough randomized evaluations in this space to really be doing effective cost effectiveness analysis on these types of interventions, but it's certainly something that we hope to do in the future, and we do have a team within JPAL that's dedicated specifically to just looking at those types of questions.
Great, thank you, Aprille, and thank you, Milt, for your question. We have a hand raised from Debbie Trent. Debbie, your microphone is now live. I believe you're self-muted. So if you want to try and unmute yourself, you can ask your question live to Aprille and Killian. Okay, we can come back to Debbie and move on with the next question. So the next question comes from Kay Abbott, who writes that the findings are very specific to the community included in the trial and not applicable in a broader sense. Also, the assumption that you've chosen two identical groups, one included and one counterfactual, is risky, as outsiders do not necessarily know the differences that matter, but identify their own indicators. So I guess that's more a question about how are you guys developing your indicators for such projects?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for this specific project, they used a number of really interesting and innovative data measurement techniques in which they looked at sort of indices of psychological impacts as well as social networks. So I guess, Killian, I don't know if you want to jump in at all on how the indicators were constructed for this project.
Yeah, I guess part of what I'm hearing in that question is sort of the challenge of generalizability. To what extent do we think that these effects would replicate elsewhere? And while it's certainly true that we don't think that Abdul Talk's exact program would work in any given community in exactly the same way, that's definitely not the point of the study. I think what we do see is that some of the ways in which social capital are being measured and social trust are being measured are sort of interesting measures where they asked different people in the community what kinds of associational activities they took part in, whether they went to PTA meetings, ways in which they would be willing to lend money to other people, who those people might be. And so one of the interesting things that comes from this study is sort of seeing and quantifying that positive impact of these reconciliation programs. Having randomized the treatment, we have the understanding that in expectation, they're statistically equivalent. The authors also look at through a balance table on a range of different observable characteristics to show ways in which those two communities, or sorry, I should say those two sets of communities are broadly similar. And then seeing how social trust and social capital have increased, measuring them, I think, in really interesting ways that go beyond the life of an RCT, but could be used by anyone applying any kind of evaluation technique, but then also show that there are also these costs. So the positives come at the cost of individual psychological well-being. And I think it's that broader understanding of what a reconciliation ceremony at local level is doing, the ways in which it's able to contribute both positively and negatively, that we think is the great contribution of this study, and that we think would apply in general ways in different places. We'd have to think that through in terms of understanding how we would expect effects to play out in a different situation. One of the key aspects of the study was that it came 10 years after the conflict, and the authors talk a lot about ways in which the timing of that reconciliation process may have been very different, produced different effects than it might have had it come earlier, and talk about some of the trade-offs there. But I think it's those broader principles that we're trying to learn about and then think about how they apply in their situation.
Great, thank you, Killian. The next question comes from Stephen Schemer of the Frontier Design Group. And Stephen asks, do you use any other data than the survey data to evaluate the effectiveness of peace-building programs?
Sure. Oftentimes, and within the randomized evaluations that the affiliates within our network are doing, is using a lot of different types of methodologies to gather data on the impact of these programs. So survey data is just one example of that, but oftentimes they are paired with qualitative evidence as well. So doing focus groups or individual interviews to assess the impact of a program that might not necessarily come through more quantitative survey measures. To sort of balance out the quantitative aspects of the program.
Great, thank you very much, Aprille. The next question comes from Zach Tilton, and Zach writes, recent studies from the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank highlight the role impact evaluations might play in supporting implementation, and that this evidence could help mitigate the cancellation of commissioned impact evaluations. From 2006 to 2016, among the 531 impact evaluations that the IDB commissioned, only 94 were completed, while 286 were still ongoing and 151 were cancelled. Does JPAL have similar information about the percentage of and reasons behind cancelled impact evaluations commissioned at JPAL, and what are the implications that this might have for the future of impact evaluations in peacebuilding?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I should note that the crime, violence, and conflict sector within JPAL is one of our newest. It's only been around for about a year now, but something that we are looking to measure over the next few years through a grant that we have received from DFID is looking at the number of impact evaluations that are completed on their scheduled timelines, how many of the randomized evaluations we fund are delayed for various reasons, and trying to unpack why that's happened, to see if it's due to changes in government or what the potential causes are for delaying randomized evaluations from kind of being carried through as they were originally planned. So we don't have specific data on this currently, but it's a really important question and something that we do take into consideration and hope to know more of in the future. And I think just to note that randomized evaluations are quite a time commitment, and there are many things that can disrupt them. So yes, it's an important question to try to figure out what are those potential barriers, and the more data we can gather on that, the more I think we can help to inform future research in this area to mitigate some of those risks.
I think the next question from Isabel Peter feeds into some of those points quite well. And Isabel writes, what does someone need to take into account in designing a peacebuilding program or results framework at the outset when one wants to conduct a randomized impact evaluation, for example, choosing certain indicators, etc.?
Yeah. Sorry, something else that Killian just noted to me that I should have raised too is something that within JPEL we have within JPEL we host the AEA registry, which is a registry of randomized controlled trials to be a way to pre-register projects that are about to happen, so that we can see what types of randomized evaluations are happening. And this is a way of getting around the fact that often after a randomized evaluation is completed, if it happens to have null results, we don't often find out about those findings. That tends to not be what's really of most interest to economic journals, and as a result of that, these evaluations take place, but they are contributing to the evidence base, but we're not necessarily hearing about these null effects. So I think that that's a really important contribution for being able to track the types of peace-building randomized evaluations that are taking place, and knowing if they are pre-registered, even if they did not actually achieve the desired impacts that they were hoping for, and still having that on record is a really beneficial way of just helping to move the field forward. And related to the specific types of indicators to develop, actually having some of these things registered on the AEA registry is really helpful as well, because part of that is registering pre-analysis plans, having actually some of the surveys available for public consumption so that others can be seeing what types of indicators are being used in some projects and start to apply those to their own.
Thank you very much, Aprille. The next question comes from Colleen Duggan of the International Development Research Centre. And Colleen writes, just wondering if JPAL is contemplating combining their RCT methodology with other methods in order to dive more deeply in negative effects uncovered. For example, in the Sierra Leone example, it would be interesting for policymakers to have some recommendations on how future programs could offset negative traumatic effects. Do you mix methods or pair up with other organizations to do a bit more of a mixed method evaluation? It could be a great contribution for future program design.
Yeah, that's a really great question and a really well taken point. JPEL has traditionally focused on randomized evaluations just because this is sort of our bread and butter, and it's what most of our affiliated professors really do specialize in. So we've really tried to maintain that focus on randomized evaluation just in order to kind of promote the rigor within our organization and make sure that when we are making statements about what we think works and what we think doesn't work, it really is clear that that is informed by very rigorous evaluation methods. That's certainly not to say that other evaluation methodologies are not important or equally beneficial in other instances. It's just not what JPEL has decided to focus its time and efforts on. But we certainly see often in many of the projects coming out of our affiliated professors' work that while randomized evaluations are one component of the larger evaluation, they often are coupled with qualitative measures as well. So as I was saying earlier, combining surveys with focus groups and interviews is a really great way to unpack the impact of a program. And this is something that actually that our colleagues at Innovation for Poverty Action are starting to think of doing a little bit more as well through something they're calling the Right Fit Initiative, where they are starting to think about how other mixed methods and other quasi-experimental approaches can be used to answer some of these really difficult questions.
Thank you, Aprille, and thank you, Colleen, for your detailed question. The next question comes from Marcia Bass of the Carter Center. Marcia writes, for the control community, how do you gain trust, ensure participation, and communicate results?
Yeah, this is a really great question. So it certainly varies by the study, but often, and especially within peace-building interventions, there are many ways in which you could think about not necessarily denying treatment to either group, but doing different treatments in each group as a way of gaining trust in a control community. So maybe in one community giving a cash transfer, whereas in another community you're giving a voucher or something of that sort. So in that way, you can get buy-in from both communities, which can help to build that trust and to make sure that you're able to follow through with both communities, because obviously attrition is something that we have to worry about in order to make sure that our results are statistically significant. And in terms of communicating results, this is something that we've actually been thinking more and more about at JPEL. I think that often there are some professors who are really great about going back into communities and sharing results with the communities that were actually involved in those processes, but it's not something that is always the case, and it's something that we are hoping to encourage more of.
Great, thank you very much, Aprille. The next question comes from Stanley Garuba, who is based in Nigeria. And Stanley writes, thank you for presenting this experience. You talked about the psychological impact. Did you experience in any community where the psychological impact escalated to retaliation? And if not, how did the study manage to prevent or mitigate retaliation?
That's a great question. Because I was not actually a member of the research team, I don't know the exact answer to that. As far as I'm aware, I'm not aware of any incidents of retaliation, but I could follow up with you on that and what specific processes were in place to prevent retaliation. But I'm not sure of the answer to that. Killian, if you're still alive, I don't know if you happen to know.
I'm actually not specifically aware of that either.
Okay, no problem. Well, I think that there's a couple of questions that have come in really about, are there any ethical challenges in conducting a randomized evaluation in this, like your examples are the project at large, were there any ethical challenges?
Yeah, this is a common question that we get about randomized evaluations, is the ethics of it. So there's often questions about, as I mentioned earlier, denying treatment to some segments of the population versus others, and how this might be perceived by the community, especially following a conflict, if one part of the population is seen as potentially benefiting in a way that others are not, and if some segments of the population are being denied treatment, this could be a little bit politically unpalatable. So it's something that certainly needs to be taken into consideration in the research design. But as I mentioned earlier, there often with many of these types of interventions, we don't have the resources to necessarily deliver the program to the entire population. So in instances like that, by randomly assigning treatment to parts of the population, that actually can be a way of potentially more ethically delivering the treatment, especially if it's done in a very transparent manner, potentially through a public lottery where people can see who is receiving the treatment and know that it's done in a random fashion. That can actually help ease tensions in some ways. There's also ways to do a randomized evaluation to phase in an intervention, so that can help ensure that all parts of the population do eventually get it, but responding, as in the case of Fumble Talk, to their own internal capacity constraints to actually do this intervention with more than a certain number of communities simultaneously. By phasing in the program, we can actually see how it's affecting communities that receive it earlier versus those who will eventually receive it, but at a later date. And so there's still ways to randomize that and to be able to collect information on the impact of the program without denying treatment to others.
Thank you, Aprille. I guess this next question is a follow-on question from Isabel Peter about how do you control the treatment on the control group? For example, what do you do if members of the control group want to join the treatment group? In the context where I work, it is difficult to refuse someone to join, which can even have a negative impact on the person who's refused, and they can become a threat to the program. The same for members of the treatment group who decide to leave.
Yeah, this is a really great question, and also something that needs to be taken into consideration when designing a randomized evaluation. So we call this non-compliance, when either someone in the control group somehow takes up treatment, or if a person who was assigned to the treatment group doesn't actually receive the intervention. So the biggest consideration, I think, in terms of mitigating this compliance issue is choosing your level of randomization. So for instance, if you're doing a program, potentially delivering an education program within a school, it would be difficult to assign that just to individual students without potentially seeing other students want to take up the program, or for other students to also receive some of the benefit of being in the same school as students that are receiving the program, even if they are not directly involved in it. So with that type of example, you might want to randomize at the school level so everyone within the school receives the treatment, and you have less risk of both spillovers, but also that compliance issue of people potentially being upset that they're not involved in the treatment and trying to seek out the treatment. So this is obviously something that can be really difficult depending on the population that you're working with and the sample size that you have available. But it's definitely something that should be taken into consideration at the design stage. And often researchers also try to make sure that that level of randomization is sufficiently dispersed. So if they're, for instance, in this reconciliation study, making sure that communities were sufficiently far apart where communities that were in the control group versus the treatment didn't necessarily know that others were receiving some type of intervention, which helps to mitigate the desire to also seek out that intervention.
Great. Thank you very much, Aprille, and thank you to the DME for Peace audience. I think we're just about coming up on time today. So I want to thank Aprille and Cillian for their sort of engagement with the DME for Peace community, and Aprille for a wonderful presentation. Just a reminder to everyone online, we have recorded today's webinar and it'll be available on the DME for Peace media gallery. We've got a discussion forum on DME for Peace under each of these sort of resources, so please feel free to continue the discussion there. Thanks once again to Aprille and Cillian. We'll be back in August with a new set of Thursday Talk webinars. So you should have information about those webinars in your inbox in the not too distant future. And one final plug before we go offline today, on DME for Peace, we had a very exciting week. On Tuesday, we launched the Human Rights Hub, which is DME for Peace's new human rights community of practice as part of our work on the human rights support mechanism. And we have now sort of working with human rights organizations to create a space for collaboration and knowledge sharing, specifically amongst the peace building and human rights community. So I encourage you to check it out, and I'd love to hear your feedback. Thank you, everyone. Thank you again, Aprille and Cillian, and I hope you all have a great rest of your week.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Doug.